The dress swayed like a ghost from the low limb of a cottonwood, catching the pale fire of dawn. Below it, one boot lay half buried in the dust, heel tilted as though someone had run out of time before they ran out of road. Eli Calder stood frozen, hat clutched tight in his hand, his face lined by years of prairie wind and disappointment. He had risen early to prepare for a wedding, but instead he found a riddle, a dress with no bride, a boot with no foot, and silence thick enough to press against his ribs. From the horizon, the iron scream of a train whistle broke through the still air. It carried no joy of arrivals, only the warning of distance, of someone already gone. Eli's hand slipped into his coat pocket, where a folded telegram rasped against his knuckles each time he touched it. The words inside were carved into his memory. "The bride you hired never existed." He'd read it twice, then 3 times, wondering if his eyes or the wires had failed him. But here was proof stitched into the morning light that what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life had already been stolen. He thought of his daughter May, still curled beneath a patched quilt in the sod house a mile away. Last night she'd tied a ribbon for the woman she believed would be her new mother, her first since her own had died. May had whispered, "She'll like it, won't she, Pa?" And Eli had promised, though promises had always been harder to keep than to make. Now, looking at the abandoned boot, he felt the ache of another promise already broken. The wind pushed at the cottonwood until its branches hissed. Eli reached up, fingers brushing the hem of the dress. Dust clung to his skin, fell back like the remains of something burned. His chest tightened. Somewhere behind him a horse stamped, impatient. Somewhere else, a man cleared his throat, as if waiting for him to turn. The prairie, vast and merciless, had always demanded answers, but this morning it gave him only questions. Where had she gone? Who had left this message in cloth and silence? And worst of all, was he mourning a woman he never truly knew? Or was he standing at the edge of a story that had only just begun? The sun broke higher, casting long, blood-colored shadows across the dust. Eli whispered into the wind, "Ada Bell, or whoever you are." And the prairie kept its secrets, the letters that built a future. Months earlier, the story had begun not with a dress, but with ink on paper. Eli Calder had answered a modest advertisement, buried in the back pages of the St. Louis Republican. It read, "Gentleman of means, homesteader, widower, seeks a lady of character and courage to share in the building of a future. Correspondence invited." He signed his name slowly, as if every letter cost him more than a stamp, then folded it and sent it off with the hope that loneliness might find an answer. The reply came 2 weeks later, a letter sealed with a pressed sprig of acacia. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, each word a careful step toward trust. "My name is Ada Bell. I was raised with no family to speak of, but I am willing to make one if God provides. I favor the color of late summer wheat and the smell of bread fresh from the oven. Tell me, Mr. Calder, is the prairie sky as large as they say?" Eli read those lines to May at the kitchen table. The little girl leaned forward, her brown hair falling over her cheek, her eyes bright as if she could already see a mother's shadow moving through the sod house. More letters followed, one each week, until they filled a tin box by the hearth. Ada asked about his farm, about May, about the winters that tore across the plains. She spoke of her desire for warmth, for purpose, for a place where her life might matter. Each page carried the softness of someone reaching across distance to touch a stranger's hand. And Eli, who had learned to measure his days by chores and silence, found himself smiling in the evenings as he dipped his pen, answering questions he had long stopped asking himself. But beyond his home, Abelia was a town on edge. The railroad surveyors had set their stakes in the earth, and every wooden marker felt like a nail driven into the heart of the community. Banker Silas Hart, with his immaculate suit and gold watch, tightened his grip on the deeds of half the valley. Sheriff Bram Kincaid kept peace with a hard stare, and deputies who carried their guns like they were part of their bones. Neighbors whispered of foreclosures, of land being stolen one contract at a time. And so the letters became a refuge. As the world closed in with iron and ink, Eli's heart leaned toward the woman whose words promised something softer, something he had almost forgotten: hope. When the stagecoach finally arrived, with Ada Bell stepping down into the dust, bonnet shading her face, Eli thought the letters had built him a future. But he did not yet know that futures can be built on lies just as easily as on love. A quiet supper, a loaded question. The evening after Ada Bell arrived, Eli lit the lamp in his low-roofed sod house and set a simple supper on the table: stew thick with beans and onions, a loaf of coarse bread, and chicory brewed dark in tin mugs. May sat between them, chattering about her favorite hen and asking if Ada knew how to braid hair. Ada smiled gently, answering in short, steady sentences, but her eyes flickered restlessly, noting the walls, the beams, even the cracks in the floorboards. To Eli, it seemed the gaze of someone drinking in a new life. To Ada Clara Wynne, in truth, it was reconnaissance. She had accepted the assignment weeks before when a Pinkerton contact slipped her a dossier marked with the name of Abelia's banker, Silas Hart. Cattle theft, fraudulent mortgages, laundering money through the railroad, his crimes bled across the page. Clara's job was to enter the town under the guise of a mail-order bride, her cover giving her reason to linger without suspicion. Yet here, at this modest table, the scent of stew in the air, she felt something she hadn't expected: the warmth of belonging. Eli spoke quietly, his voice a low drawl smoothed by years of labor. "It's not much, Miss Bell. Just dirt and sweat. But it's honest. Are you certain you can make a life so far from city lights and music halls?" His eyes searched hers, not with suspicion, but with an earnestness that almost disarmed her. Clara forced a smile. "I came for more than lights," she said softly. "I came for steadiness." May laughed, spilling her milk, and Eli's rough hand swept the mess away with a rag before offering his daughter a wink. Clara watched the tenderness between father and child, and the lies she wore around her shoulders grew heavier. When May finally drifted off to bed, Eli rose to stoke the fire. As he bent, the poker shifted a loose plank in the floor, revealing the edge of a rolled map beneath. Clara's breath caught. She glimpsed rail lines traced in neat ink, shipments scrawled with codes she knew from her training. Why would a homesteader guard such a map? Before she could speak, Eli pressed the board back down, his hand covering the secret as if it were part of his body. "Some things best left where they lay," he said, his voice calm but edged with warning. Clara lowered her gaze to her untouched bread, her mind racing. Was Eli a victim of Silas Hart, or something far more complicated? The night outside roared with wind, but inside the house, the silence cut sharper than any storm. The prairie's unsaid things. In the days that followed, Clara learned the rhythm of Abelia, not by what people said, but by what they left unsaid. The prairie itself spoke louder than the townsfolk, its winds carrying secrets across the open land, its silence pressing down on every unfinished word. She walked with May to the little schoolhouse where Nora Little Sky taught letters and numbers, her beadwork glinting at the cuffs of her blouse. Nora's presence was tolerated, not embraced by many in town. The children adored her, but Clara caught the way the preacher's wife clutched her shawl tighter each time Nora passed. Deputy Tomas Ortega kept a steady hand on the law, though most men treated him as if his badge carried less weight than his accent. He nodded politely at Clara when their paths crossed, his eyes always scanning as though danger hung in the corners of every building. Clara recognized the same wariness in herself. It didn't take long before she saw what held the town together and what was slowly tearing it apart. The grain elevator loomed like a cathedral, and everything that passed through it, wheat, cattle contracts, even forged deeds, was touched by Silas Hart's hand. Banker by title, master by ambition. Clara avoided his gaze when he strolled across Main Street, but one morning his eyes found hers. She froze, the years falling away. He had been her stepfather once, the man who controlled her mother with the stroke of a pen and the tightening of a smile. She had fled his house at 16, vowing never to stand in his shadow again. And yet, here he was, fatter in the face but sharper in the eyes, the same wolf beneath a finer coat. That evening, Eli returned from town with his jaw set tight. He laid a folded paper on the table, a list of men, names inked in haste. Clara's eyes traced the roll: Calder, Everett Ortega, Chung, O'Reilly. These were the ones Silas Hart sought to break, the homesteaders who resisted selling their land to the railroad. "It's a fight dressed up in ledgers," Eli muttered. "We hold the dirt, but he holds the law." Clara's hand tightened on the paper. If the Pinkerton reports were true, this was more than a local squabble. It was a scheme to bleed families dry, then seize their land in the name of progress. And here sat Eli Calder, already marked as an enemy. She had sworn to dismantle Silas Hart's empire, but the man across the table was no longer just a subject in her investigation. He was the one person who might lose everything if she failed. Outside, the prairie winds hissed against the doorframe, carrying the promise of storms to come. And Clara whispered to herself, "Justice and love rarely live in the same house. Which will you choose, girl?" Courting under a tin roof. The rain came sudden, hammering against the sod roof until the whole house seemed to hum. Inside, the lantern glow softened the edges of the room. Clara sat at the table with May, showing her how to fold a paper bird from an old newspaper sheet, while Eli stirred a pot on the stove. Each roll of thunder seemed to draw them closer, as if the storm outside was a curtain shutting the world away. When May yawned and was sent to bed, Eli poured 2 mugs of chicory and set one in front of Clara. He sat across from her, his hands rough, nails lined with dirt from the day's labor. "Never thought I'd write to a stranger," he said with a crooked smile. "Thought it foolish. But your letters, they made me feel less like a man staring at a field that won't answer back." His words hung heavy, softened only by the patter of rain. Clara felt a warmth she hadn't expected coil in her chest. She reminded herself that every detail she revealed in her own letters had been a calculated half-truth. Yet the man before her spoke with a raw honesty that unsettled her, far more than deceit ever could. Eli leaned back, his eyes shadowed. "You should know I ain't just a farmer scratching at the dirt. Me and some others, neighbors mostly, we've been meeting in barns out in the gullies. Hart's been bleeding families dry with his loans, then sending the sheriff to collect when they can't pay. It ain't justice, it's theft dressed in scripture and law." His hand tapped the table once, firm. "We mean to stop it." Clara's pulse quickened. This was the alliance she had read about in coded reports. Men who burned their notes after meetings, who risked jail or worse to keep the land theirs. She had come to Abelia to expose Silas Hart, but now Eli Calder was not just a victim, he was part of the resistance. As if to punctuate his words, a rider approached through the storm. Hoofbeats splashed mud outside before fading. Eli stepped to the door and returned with a sodden slip of paper. Clara read the scrawl. "Wedding moved to sunrise. Safer that way. No signature." She looked at Eli, his jaw tightened, eyes dark with suspicion. "Somebody's rushing us," he said, "and I'll be damned if I know whether it's to bless us or to bury us." The storm outside deepened, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath. A promise at gunpoint, kindness and lies. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the prairie slick with mud and smelling of wet earth. Clara rose early, her mind restless from a night of half-sleep. She had dreamt of trains screaming through the valley, carrying away every acre of land, every honest family, until only smoke and silence remained. At the table, Eli sat sharpening his knife, the scrape steady as a heartbeat. When he finally spoke, the words cut sharper than steel. "I didn't answer that ad just for company," he said without looking up. "I figured the banker's men might try something, send a woman to pry into my life. So I played along, thought I'd spot the trick." His eyes lifted then, softer. "But somewhere between the letters, I stopped caring if you were bait. I wanted you to be real." Clara's chest tightened. He had laid his suspicion bare, yet confessed his longing in the same breath. She felt cornered not by threats, but by a kindness she hadn't earned. For the first time since taking the assignment, her Pinkerton star weighed heavy against her skin, not as a badge of duty, but as a chain. By noon, the town stirred with quiet tension. Men lingered outside the saloon and women whispered in doorways. Word had spread that the Calder wedding would be at sunrise, though no one seemed to know who had sent the note. Clara's instincts screamed of a trap, and when she caught sight of a familiar figure stepping off the train, her handler, Mr. Whitley, disguised in a neat suit and introducing himself as a railroad auditor, her fears hardened. That evening she slipped into the shadows near Silas Hart's office. Through a thin crack in the shutters, she saw Whitley seated across from Hart, ledger books open between them. They weren't adversaries, they were partners. Hart leaned forward, his heavy hand tapping a list of names, Calder among them. Clara's stomach turned. The man who had trained her to uncover corruption was in league with it, feeding her crumbs while he feasted at the table. She returned to Eli's house with mud on her hem and a storm raging inside her. If she told him the truth, he might never forgive her. If she stayed silent, she would betray the very family she had begun to love. Outside, a coyote cried into the dark. Inside, Eli reached for her hand across the table. His voice was low, steady. "Whatever comes tomorrow, promise me one thing. Don't lie to me again." And in that moment, Clara realized the hardest promise to keep was the one that asked for the truth. The bride disappears. The prairie was still gray with night when Eli rose, expecting to prepare for vows and a new beginning. But instead of a bride's soft footsteps, he found absence. The bed was cold, the house silent, the door left ajar. Outside, a dress swung from a cottonwood like a flag of surrender, one boot abandoned in the dust below it. The sight cut him deeper than any blade. By the time he reached town, whispers had already bloomed along Main Street. Runaway bride. She got spooked. Can't trust a woman you meet by mail. Eli clenched his fists, but said nothing, his jaw a wall against humiliation. Sheriff Kincaid, standing in front of the jailhouse with his deputies, smirked just enough to fan the rumors. "Hard thing, Calder," he said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. "Guess she figured the plains weren't meant for her kind." But Eli noticed more than the words. Wagon tracks led toward the rail yard, fresh and deep, the kind that came from hurried hands and heavier cargo than a single woman's satchel. And there, in the dust, smears of axle grease marked a trail too careless to be chance. Clara had not simply vanished. Someone had staged her disappearance. That evening, a notice appeared tacked to the saloon door. A wanted poster bearing Eli's name accused him of aiding train robbers, charges punishable by hanging. The handwriting was crude, but the seal at the bottom bore the sheriff's stamp. A murmur rippled through the crowd as townsfolk gathered, half believing the accusation, half relieved it wasn't their own name nailed to the wood. Inside the saloon, the piano struck a tense tune, notes tumbling like nervous laughter. Men eyed Eli as though he already wore a noose. He stood beneath the poster, his face hard as stone. "She didn't run," he muttered to Tomas Ortega, who had slipped quietly to his side. "They took her, and now they mean to take me too." Tomas's eyes darted to the sheriff across the street, then back to Eli. "If that's true, amigo, You have less time than you think." Eli looked once more at the abandoned dress, whipping in the prairie wind, then at the poster branding him an outlaw. Between them stretched the space where trust, love, and truth had been swallowed whole, and he knew the fight had come home. A town splits in two. The news spread like wildfire. Eli Calder wanted for aiding train robbers. By sundown, Abelia was no longer one town, but two. On one side stood those who owed their land and livelihood to Silas Hart's bank, merchants, ranchers, and the preacher who muttered of justice while pocketing Hart's coin. On the other were the stubborn few, homesteaders, railroad hands cheated of wages, and families who clung to dirt as if it were their last inheritance. Deputy Tomas Ortega chose his side quickly. While Sheriff Kincaid rallied a posse, Tomas slipped Eli and little May into the cellar beneath the schoolhouse, lit only by a stub of candle. Nora Little Sky brought them bread wrapped in cloth and whispered, "The sheriff spreads lies louder than truth." But lies can be broken. Her steady eyes gave Eli strength, though fear gnawed at him. His daughter slept curled against him, ribbons still tied in her hair, as if clinging to the dream of a mother who had vanished like morning mist. Meanwhile, Clara lay bound in the office of the grain elevator. The air was thick with the stench of dust and mice, her wrists raw from the rope. Through a crack in the wall, she heard the heavy shuffle of Silas Hart's boots and the clipped tones of Mr. Whitley. They spoke not of law, but of property and profit. "Once Calder's alliance is crushed, the deeds fall to us," Silas said, his voice slick with satisfaction. "The railroad won't care whose names are on the graves." Whitley's answer came smooth, practiced. "The Pinkertons were never chasing you, Mr. Hart. They were protecting you, and my operative. She delivered herself right into your hands." Clara's stomach twisted. The man who had sworn her into service had used her as a pawn in Hart's scheme. As dusk fell, she caught the glint of a lantern set too close to the grain chute. The flame wavered, then steadied, licking the wood. Panic surged through her chest. If fire touched the grain, the whole elevator would become an inferno. She pulled against the ropes until blood welled on her wrists, her breath ragged. Back in the cellar, Nora unrolled a charred scrap of paper she had found near the saloon stove. Half-burned words scrawled across it. "Evidence. Grain elevator, midnight." Eli's eyes widened, heart thundering. Clara had left a trail, however faint. Above them, the prairie wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke. Smoke, secrets, and a choice. By the time the church bell tolled midnight, Abelia's horizon was rimmed with smoke. The grain elevator loomed black against the firelit sky, its wooden ribs groaning as sparks danced upward like frantic stars. Eli, Thomas, and Nora moved swiftly through the shadows of the rail yard, rifles slung low, hearts pounding in rhythm with the crackle of burning grain. May clung to Nora's skirt until the teacher urged her into hiding behind a stack of crates. Inside the elevator office, Clara worked the boot nail she'd wedged into her bonds, twisting until the rope snapped and her wrists burned free. She pressed her ear to the floorboards and heard the scuff of boots, the low growl of men arguing. Silas Hart's voice rose above the rest, thick with arrogance. "Once the fire clears this place, we'll have the perfect story. Calder's men blamed, land foreclosed, and the railroad ours to feed." But another voice broke through the smoke, Sheriff Kincaid, weary and raw. Clara froze as she caught his words. "You talk of justice, Hart, but I know what justice is. Years ago, I bent the law to push Calder's kin off this land. His wife's cousins, good men, I branded them as thieves to keep the peace. I carry that weight every sunrise. Don't ask me to do it again." His confession rattled Clara more than the flames. He had loved Eli's first wife, and in that twisted love he had destroyed her family. The office door burst open as Eli stormed in, smoke rolling around his shoulders. His eyes locked on Clara, alive, battered but unbroken. Relief flared in his chest, chased instantly by fury at the sight of Whitley holding a pistol to her temple. "Stay where you are," Whitley barked, sweat shining on his brow. "This is bigger than you, Calder. Step back and you might live to see your girl grow up." Clara's heart hammered. She had one chance, one truth left. She turned her gaze on Eli, voice cutting through the chaos. "I lied to you. My name isn't Ada. I came here as a spy, but I never meant to betray you. Not you, not May." Eli's grip on his rifle tightened, torn between rage and trust, between the woman who had deceived him and the only hope left of saving his town. Sparks rained from the rafters. Above the roar of fire, May's small voice echoed from the ladder where she had climbed, holding out a rope. "Pa, catch!" The moment hung suspended. Love, betrayal, justice, and survival, all balanced on the edge of firelight and choice. Resolution and legacy. The grain elevator roared like a furnace, timbers cracking as smoke boiled into the night. Eli caught the rope May tossed down, his calloused hands burning as he swung it across the room. Clara seized it, pulling herself free from Whitley's grip, just as Eli lunged, knocking the pistol from the Pinkerton's hand. The weapon clattered into the flames below, swallowed in sparks. Silas Hart stumbled backward, clutching his ledgers as if they could shield him from fire. But Tomas and Nora burst through the smoke, rifles raised. "Drop them papers," Tomas commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. Hart hesitated, greed fighting fear, until a flaming beam crashed inches from his boots. The ledgers tumbled to the floor, and Nora stamped out the fire, licking their edges. Inside the pages lay the proof. Fraudulent deeds, bribes, and the names of every man bought or ruined by Hart's schemes. Whitley tried to flee through the loading bay, but the collapsing timbers betrayed him. With a strangled cry, he vanished beneath falling beams, the fire claiming him and the lies he had carried. Sheriff Kincaid, coughing from smoke, staggered forward and unpinned his star, dropping it in the dirt. His eyes met Eli's, shame hollowing his face. "I can't undo what I done to your wife's kin," he rasped, "but I won't wear the badge of a man who twisted justice for pride." Then he walked into the dark, no posse behind him, only silence. When the flames died to embers, Abelia gathered in uneasy dawn. Families read the ledgers aloud, their voices trembling but resolute. The truth spread faster than fear, and Hart's empire crumbled with the morning light. Eli stood with May's hand in one of his and Clara's in the other, torn between anger for her deception and gratitude for her courage. She spoke before he could. "I came here with lies, but the love I found, your daughter's trust, your kindness, that was never false." Eli studied her a long moment, then said quietly, "On the prairie, folks can change. Soil turns to wheat, storms turn to rain. Maybe lies can turn to truth if we let them." As the sun rose, casting gold across the blackened elevator, the town felt reborn. Neighbors held one another accountable, not the railroad, not the banker. Some promises Eli knew were written in ink, others in smoke. But the ones that lasted, the ones that mattered, were carved into the grain of the people who chose to stay. And for the first time in years, he believed staying might be enough.